Hello, hello. How is everybody doing today? Can everybody see and hear me? Okay. Excellent. Very good. All right, wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Let me see. Okay, we got over 100 attendees. This is fantastic. For those of you that have attended our webinars in the past, there will be Joseph King and Kate Stone monitoring the chat. And so if you have any questions that you want answered, just type them in the chat. They'll mark them. And then when we get to a good conversation point, we will go back through and I'll answer your questions. If not, we'll do that at the end. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to talk a little bit about, I'm just going to share my presentation here. Whoopsies, starting a little bit ahead of the game. Okay, can everybody see my, okay, can everybody see slide one here? We good? Okay, great. So today's webinar is actually, it's a little bit of an off-the-wall idea that we had internally. A lot of times we have meetings with our support team. We have a great support staff of 5 people across both coasts, we're constantly talking about what we're doing with hardware, software, settings, shortcuts, that kind of stuff to make one another as efficient as possible. And so I thought it would be kind of interesting to show everybody what my literal setup is, preferences, key bindings, that sort of thing, and what all that I do to make sure that I'm getting the most out of Capture One. And so just to really kind of get started here, I'm not going to give you any big spiels on this. Digital transitions, us, world's largest phase 1 resource center, hardware, software, training, support, we got you covered. My name, if you haven't seen me in previous webinars, is Arnab Chatterjee. I'm a technical specialist here at DT. I do a lot of work with the commercial photography team, but you'll also hear me talking a lot about cultural heritage photography. And we got one poll going right now, but I want to put another poll in the chat, and I want to ask, what subject matter do you typically shoot? And I hope we have some culture. Okay, great. We got some cultural heritage people here. We got a good mix. Perfect. Okay, great. So one thing that I want to address is that every single one of these categories, and these are just a few categories, we can't put more than 4 or 5, is going to want to set things up differently. And so what you'll see me doing is very much suited to sort of cultural heritage, or in the commercial world, probably closer to still life photography. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go on. But just to kind of quickly go over things to keep in mind about this presentation. This is personal to me. There's no single right setup, but there are definitely wrong ones. And when I say wrong ones, I don't mean that any one workspace or set of shortcuts is bad. It's just that some things are less efficient, and there are definitely better ways of formatting things that we can kind of go through and help you with. Things are going to get really granular here because we are looking at one person's specific setup. So I want you to kind of take a step back and focus more on the concepts. If I'm talking about, okay, I set my live view shortcut to Command-Shift-K, maybe not so much like, okay, why is it Command-Shift-K specifically? More like, oh, why is he shortcutting live view? Oh, because it's something that you want to be able to pop on and off for still life or for cultural heritage photography really easily, right? So, and then another sort of core tenet here of what we're going to talk about, and you'll hear me talking about keyboard shortcuts on and on again. It's because the keyboard is always, always, always faster and more precise than clicking with the mouse. And clicking with the mouse is much more precise than scrolling or dragging with the mouse. So there's kind of that order of operations in terms of what's going to be the fastest versus what's going to be the slowest. And the last little note here is that I am presenting everything on a Mac here. Most of the functions, if not all of them, are available on the PC. The modifier keys are going to be different. You've got Control and Alt versus Command and, you know, also Option. But just to keep in mind, all of these things are going to be doable on PC. The modifier keys will just be different. Okay. And so my goal for today is, you know, I just want everybody to leave with one idea of something that maybe they didn't know or they've never really tested and tried before. Okay. And just kind of see what you can do with this information, the concepts, and test it out in your own workflow. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's talk general setup and preferences, okay? Quickly talking about workspaces. So a lot of what I'm going to be doing is actually showing my, my screen. So I found that probably the easiest way to do this is actually this screen share here. So what I'm gonna do is just take a couple of, and I apologize if you just bear with me for a second. I'm going to pull these into a separate window. I'm going to close all those. And that way I just have Demio open here. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, and can everybody see my Capture One window? Joe, could you chime in with a mic just to let me know? Okay, great. So I'm just going to use this to tab between my current tab and the other ones. So I've gotten super fast with the default workspace because just by the nature of the way that I work on things, I'm either working on, you know, a workstation on our studio, my personal laptop, a client's workstation. If I'm on site with a client, I'm going to be using a different computer. So default is the one workspace that's always there and always the same. I've gotten used to using that. You can port workspaces and key bindings in Finder, though. And so if you guys are using Macs, I want you to follow along with me here. So we're going to switch over to Finder. And if you click on the Go button up here on your top bar and you hold Option, I have it enabled here so it shows by default, but there's an option here that should say Library. Is everybody getting that? Sorry, I'm just checking the chat. Okay, good. So now that we've got that, library is going to contain a folder called Application Support. So application support is where a lot of our applications are going to be storing like log files and text files that contain the information that our custom settings include. So if I go to Capture One, and you'll see there are a bunch of subfolders here. One of those is Workspaces. And you'll see that there are a bunch of what are called p-lists in here. The only thing, you know, all a p-list is if I right-click and open it in, you know, some text editor. And you don't need to do this or know this. You just need to, you know, be able to see that all it is it's a bunch of strings. It's a fancy thing that says, okay, I want my browser width to be set to 328, and I want full screen to be, you know, false by default, right? So what this is going to do is it's going to contain all of my settings for my workspace, and I can take this plist and drag it onto a thumb drive or airdrop it onto another computer, and I can carry my workspace with me and take it to a client computer. I can do the same thing for keyboard shortcuts. I can do the same thing for recipes, process recipes, for styles. So this is a really useful thing if, you know, you're a digital tech perhaps and you want to be able to use your settings on like a laptop that you're renting, for instance, or like an iMac on set. If you need to use a particular computer, just get a flash drive, drop your p-lists on there, and then do the same thing. Go to your library on the computer you're aiming to use, navigate to this Workspaces folder, just drop it in there. You restart Capture One, and you just go to Workspace, Window, Workspace, and yours should show up here. So that's a quick way to port workspaces from one place to another. Another couple of things that I want to talk about real quick is the nice, one of the nice things about Capture One is you can add tools to any tab, right? So I can add, and I can keep adding tools until the cows come home. Things may start to get messy, though. So if I'm worried, if I'm sort of exploring all my settings and things, and I don't want to mess up any of the things that I usually use, I would suggest adding a custom tool tab. You can call it test, let's say, give it some icon. We'll make this number 3. Okay, test 2. Terrible names. Use these names, but just for the purposes here. And now if I want to make a custom tab, and I'll show you later maybe something. Sorry, guys. Am I back? Jeez, I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Where did I leave off? Okay, custom tabs. So if we go back to Capture One here and we look at our custom tabs, it's just a nice way to be able to use. There we go. Share your screen. Okay. There we go. So if I have a custom tab, I can just add all my tools on here. So if I want to test something out that I've seen someone do or learned in the webinar, and I don't want to mess up my normal tabs, I just suggest doing it in a custom tab. Okay. Now, scrolling tools. We're introducing Capture 120. I have a love-hate relationship with scrolling tools. They're super nice because you can see. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to try killing the camera. Is that any better? Is the screen resolution any better? Okay. Hopefully this won't be too much of an issue. Yikes. Okay. Let's try one more time. Is this any better? Yeah, I'm hardwired in, so it shouldn't be an issue, but I guess. Okay. Okay. So let's just kind of keep things moving. I apologize for the technical difficulties. So if I jump back to my presentation here, we're talking about scrolling tools. Scrolling tools are nice because I can see, all of my tools in their full views. One of the disadvantages, though, is if I have tools that are off screen, I can't see them by default. Whereas if I have them in like the old style, if I have a ton of things added here, I can't have them all at the same time, but I can always access the ones at the bottom. So scrolling tools are nice, but there are some times where I prefer not to use them. Just something to keep in mind. That may be something that you use, something that you don't, but it is a potential advantage to sort of speed things up is actually not using the scrolling tools. All right. Next, let's talk about packing images as EIPs. So what is an EIP? When you take a raw file and you go and edit it in Capture One, it will, by default, come in as whatever your camera raw format is, right? So if it's a Canon, it'll be a .cr2. If it's a phase one, it'll be a .iiq. Canon, I think, is, sorry, Nikon is NEF. And so those are all going to be proprietary to individual manufacturers. So the way that Capture One makes edits to files is, if I go to Capture One here, you'll see that I have these all as EIPs. I unpack this as an EIP, and then I show it in Finder here. You'll see that it actually stores the settings for the modifications that I made to that file in a separate COS file, Capture One settings. So if I look at this file, you'll see it's super small, 7 kilobytes. The only thing that's in there is text that says, you know, hey, exposure is pushed this much, you know, color balance is pushed this much. But that is how Capture One manages that by default. So the nice thing about that is that, you know, you have these small files that if you're making adjustments, it's only changing the small file, it's not changing the overall package. But if you move that IIQ somewhere and it's not moved with the proper COS file, you lose all of your edits. So when you pack an image as an EIP, that moves those into a single enhanced image package, which is what the EIP stands for. So that is, you'll see that it's disappeared here because it's gone back into our EIP here, okay? By the way, that error that keeps popping up is an error with the way that the Quick Look QLIC works with the current version of Mac OS and rendering EIPs. So that is one minor annoyance. I apologize, that will pop up a few times, but that is what that is. So that's not a Capture One issue, that's a Mac OS issue. If there's a fix for that, somebody let me know in the chat, because that would be really good to know. I am running Catalina 15.4. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay. So when do you not want to use EIPs? I saw George, I think, put this in the chat already, is when you're backing things up, right? Yeah. So the advantage of using those sidecar files with the .cos is, even though they're not packaged together in one place, you're updating a 7 kilobyte file versus updating a 300 megabyte raw image if you're shooting phase one. So that is one of the potential issues that you would run into. The other reason that you wouldn't want to pack them as an EIP is if you're using another raw processor, if you want to use Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw in Photoshop, which is effectively the same thing, or I think Affinity or something else. The settings will not carry over, so you need to make sure you have it as a different, as a separate file, and you keep it as a .cr2 or a .iiq. Okay. Clipping warnings. Okay. This is something that I want to go through just while we're talking about preferences. If you look at the exposure tab here in your preferences, you'll notice that there are a couple of settings here. There's your exposure warning and your shadow warning. Shadow warning is not as important. It's disabled by default. I like to keep it on just so I know when I've crushed my shadows and blacks too much. But you're not really going to ever lose any information there if you're shooting on a high dynamic range back. Where you are going to lose information is on the high end if you're clipping your highlights. This goes into, I mean, it's important in all types of photography, but particularly for cultural heritage and for like still life stuff, we don't want to lose any information. We want to maximize our dynamic range. So if you look at the default settings, this is set as an exposure warning for 250. And so if I turn my exposure warning on here and I just blast the exposure, you'll see that I get, oops, my exposure warning showing up on any pixel where it's above 250. But if I leave it at the default, it's possible that my image is not actually clipping. I'm just above that value, but I still have data there. So because I'm shooting under very controlled conditions, I like to keep this at 255. And during capture, I will almost always keep my exposure warning on, just so I can see, oops, immediately if and when I'm clipping. Sorry, my computer is slowing down a little bit here. Let's see, where's my exposure warning? Okay. Well, not sure what's going on there. Okay, there we go. Got it back. All right. Okay. The other thing I want to point out is when you're capturing in particular, when I'm shooting for exposing to the right, I'll always use linear scientific, and that is available for phase 1 files. The reason that I'll use that is because linear scientific is completely unforgiving in my highlights. If I blow my highlights, it will usually turn pink and it will not even attempt to save them or gently roll them off, versus linear response, which will say, okay, we can logically tell that this is a sky and it's probably not pink, so it'll roll things off gently in the highlights. If I want to see like where I'm hard clipping, I want to use linear scientific. And so a lot of folks in the cultural heritage world will use that when they're capturing. Realistically, when you're presenting images, you're never going to present anything in linear scientific. You want to present them at least in linear response. But during the capture side of things, I'll use linear scientific. And so the combination of the exposure warning and shooting in linear scientific is how I make sure I don't have clipping in any of my images. Okay, I'm going to go over a couple more things and then we'll take questions. Real quickly, I'm going to actually put this first. Rapid navigation at magnified views. If I'm looking at an image and, you know, if I'm shooting a high resolution camera, I'm zoomed into 100% here, and I want to get to the opposite corner, I can double click and then click on to the other side, or I can right click on the image. It'll pull up, if I'm using the hand tool, it'll pull up a little mini navigator and I can drag my box around my image, which is super useful because I get a view of what the overall image is, but I can find my high magnification point within it and simply drag it around. So this is good for giving you context even when you're zoomed in really far. And the last bit here is I'm just going to talk about some of my key bindings that I use a lot. When I'm selecting multiple files, if I'm going through them and I see that I want to work on a single image and I need to just select that one, I set my key binding to P to just select the primary variant. That way you don't have to deselect everything and then find the one that you want to select and just select that one. You can quickly just go through all of them, say, okay, I want this one of Niels right here, hit P, and now we've got our color professor full screen. Okay. Another one that I use really often, particularly for cultural heritage, is color readouts. I've hotkeyed that to Option R. And so color readouts, if you don't use them, are super, super useful. They will drop onto parts of your image, and they'll show you, by default, the RGB values. right? And so I can see exactly where these fall. If you're in the cultural heritage world, or if for some reason you want to see lab color, Capture One does actually now support even, and this is Capture One Pro, now supports lab readout. If you go to View, Lab Readout, you can turn it on. And so I've hotkeyed this to Command L, and then, or sorry, Option L, and then Option Shift L goes back to RGB. So I can quickly switch between the two. And this is something that I use a lot for cultural heritage imaging to make sure my colors are right when I'm shooting targets and making sure my white balance is right. I can check my lab values really quickly. Okay. Command E was what I was using to turn the exposure warning on and off. By the way, the things that are green are my custom settings. The things that are gray are default settings. Command B and T, of course, these are super trivial, but they're showing your browser for B and tools for T. And then by default, I think in Capture 120, it's just G, but previously it was Command Option V to hide your viewer. And this is really nice if you just want to see the sort of grid view of your images, and also if you have like hundreds of images and you want to see like all the data alongside them. You don't really want your viewer taking up all that space. So you just turn it off with G or Command Option V, depending on what version you're using. I actually have gotten used to some of the old shortcuts, so I actually reprogrammed them to the old ones. So I actually use Command Option V for that. And then Command Control F, or just F in Capture 120, is full screen. Again, this is something that is very useful if you just want to get a quick look at all of your images. By the way, if you have all these color readouts on and you want to get rid of one, you don't have to switch tools. You can just hit Option. It changes from plus to minus. You can pull them off individually, or you can just right-click and delete all readouts. So quick tool there. Change this back to this view here. And the last one, and this is one that I use all the time. I'm constantly moving files from point A to point B, sometimes from computer to computer. So if I'm working on a raw file, I want to be able to find that file in Finder really quickly. So I've actually hotkeyed this show in Finder function to F12. So all I have to do is hit one keystroke, and it's open in Finder, it's highlighted for me, and I can drag this to wherever I want it to go. All right? So let me now pause here and take a second to answer questions. Okay. Joe, have you been marking questions?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's see, is there anything outstanding that you think I should address? Anything wrong with packing EIPs and catalogs? There shouldn't be any issues. I mean, the thing with catalogs is catalogs don't, they don't change the location of any of your files, but you still have full, editing abilities over them. To be honest, for most of my workflows, I use sessions, but I don't believe there's an issue with that. So shortcuts to close all of your tool windows at the same time. Not sure what you mean. Is that not Command T? You mean other than that? So yeah, let me share my screen again. If I'm in Capture One and I have all my tools up and I hit Command T, all of my tools go away and I can bring them back like that. Yeah, are you talking about floating tools or just like what I just showed there? Okay, let me know if that doesn't answer the question, but hopefully that does. Okay, great question. Linear response versus linear scientific. Collecting them so they're not strung all the way down. I'm not aware of any way to do that. If somebody else is, let me know, but I am not aware of that. Okay. Linear scientific versus linear response. So the big difference here, and if you look at my screen, I'm sorry, at my video, I just want to sort of demonstrate in a really simple way. Linear response takes your information and it says, look, if it's 0, it's going at 0. If it's 255, it's going at 255. And I'm not going to apply any curves to it, right? I'm not going to add any contrast to make it look nice. And keep in mind, I mean, so sensors see things linearly. The human eye does not see things linearly. It applies a contrast curve to them. So the default film standard curve applies contrast, and it gives us a nice like S response, all right? What linear response does is it says, I understand you want a linear image, but you probably don't want, if it hits 255, you probably don't want it to just drop off a cliff, right? So it says, all right, I know you want linear, but I'm just gonna curve it off the top so that you get a smooth response and you don't see any like weird color with your clipping. Whereas linear scientific says, okay, I'm gonna assume you know what you're doing and screw it, if it goes above 255, I'm gonna just totally, it'll look super weird, but I assume you know what you're doing. So linear scientific is what you're seeing here with the purple highlights. And if I switch it to linear response, it's gonna say, okay, not all of my channels are blown, so I'm gonna try and return some of this color. So you never wanna present an image like this. That just doesn't make sense. When you're capturing an image, you wanna know if you're losing this information, right? But when I go to present my image, I want it to look sort of, you know, I want it to look like it makes sense. So I can have it be linear with linear response and just have it kind of gently, you know, take care of those highlights. And the biggest areas that you'll see that are, for instance, if you're shooting a landscape and you have the sky, you'll get like hard banding. If you use linear scientific versus if you use linear response, you will get a more gentle roll off. So that's one way to think about the differences between the two. Okay. Okay, I'm going to move on. Joe, keep marking questions as they come up. But let's go on to capture. Okay. So how many of you guys, and you can just type this in the chat, capture tethered? You know, use tethered capture for more than half of what you do. Okay. Again, it's going to be all over the place depending on what type of photography you do, right? You know, if I'm shooting people in fashion, I might not do that as often, but if you're shooting tethered, then this is going to be particularly useful for you. Okay. So first and foremost, before I do any of my capturing, I want to make sure that everything is organized in terms of when I capture a file, I know it's going in the right place and I know it's going to be named something meaningful. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to hop over to my Capture One window here, and I'm going to take my handy dandy XF, turn this on, and just take a minute for it to boot up. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you how I would set up a session structure. And then one of the most useful tools for creating descriptive names in Capture One. Okay, so I'm going to just set up my guy here. So it's going to focus, get as close as possible. Okay, I apologize, my desk is kind of messy. And here we see I've got my nice phase 1 XT and my cleaning supplies. So I'm going to go ahead and before I capture this image, let's take a look at where it's going to go. So images are going to go into my capture folder. And right now, it's just called sample images. So what I want to do is I want to make something that's going to be called, let's say, XT images. And then what I do 99% this is, you know, it's not always the final way that you want to do things, but during capture, it's pretty much always the way that I'll have things set. Even if I want to rename them later, it gives them a descriptive name because it's going to name them whatever the folder that they're going into is named. So in the case that is called XT images, it's going to generate an image after I capture it, and it's going to be called XT images and then whatever my camera capture is. If I switch folders, and let's say I'm at a fashion house or I'm at a, you know, an e-commerce place, and I want to shoot look one. You know, I've got some clothing and I want to shoot look one. If I do the same thing and I capture my image, it's going to be called look one because the folder it's going into is look one. And this way, I can not only keep my images organized, I can keep them named in a way that is meaningful and useful. And even if that's not the final name it's going to have, I know that it's going to have a descriptive name and not just, you know, capture underscore one, right? Or something like that. So that's a tool that I use relatively often when I'm working with capture. Okay. I do apologize for the screen quality. I'm wired into Ethernet. I don't know of any way that I can get the screen quality up. I do apologize about that. Hopefully, you can follow along to some extent. Okay. Okay. So I just showed the naming and navigating here. This is kind of what I mentioned earlier, where I always have my exposure warning on when I'm exposing to the right. So if I go to my window here, you can see that I am totally blowing my highlights here, and I'm on linear scientific flash flat art reproduction, and I've got hotkeys set so I can actually, without touching my camera, change my exposure. And these are big files, and I'm running multiple things, so it's going to take a second to pop in here. There we go. So you can see that I brought down the exposure, and still got clipped highlights, so I'm going to bring it down one more stop, or one more third of a stop. There we go. And so that's kind of how I manage that when I'm shooting. Okay. Next thing that I want to show here is if you're shooting something where you have weird clipping tolerances, and this, what I mean by this is specifically if you're shooting film. If you're doing film scanning, which is a lot of what I do, you have two different ways that you can look at clipping. You can, let's see here, did these get reset? Scientific, scientific. All right, so I'm going to take this one, and let's bring it to, okay, there we go. So you can see that this image has no clipping, right, at all.
He should be back up. There he is. He should be back shortly.
I'm so sorry, guys. I apologize. Can everyone hear me now? I'm so sorry. I don't know what's going on here. I appreciate you guys bearing with me. Okay. So I'm going to hop back to talking about my keyboard shortcuts for this. So I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. Can everybody see my keyboard shortcuts that I'm talking about here? Okay. So I was talking about Command K. Command K is the default for capture. If I'm in particularly a cultural heritage setting and I'm shooting film, I'm shooting flat art documents where I'm shooting maybe like thousands of images a day, I'll set it to just K, right? I mean, the fewer keys I have to hit, the faster it's going to go, and more importantly, the less chance of like repetitive stress injury there is. So that's one thing that I do when I'm shooting film in particular. The other thing that I think is fun is if I'm working with a camera like this that's tethered up and I have a wireless keyboard, if I just set it to K, or I mean, whatever my keyboard setting is, I've effectively got a wireless cable release. So it's a free wireless shuttle release if you're using something like that. I always, always, always set my live view to Command-Shift-K because I'm using it so closely with Command-K or just K for capturing, and I want to be able to bring it up and down relatively quickly. I use that shortcut probably more than any other shortcut when I'm doing capturing for still life and for cultural heritage. Let's see, overlays. A lot of times if I'm shooting film in like contact sheets like this, I'll have an overlay so I know where to put it so that if we have an auto-cropping software, we'll put it in the right place. And I set that toggle to Option O. That way I can pull it on and off really quickly. Again, you can just create that in the overlay tool and drop whatever image you want in there. But that's something that I use also very often. And then Option plus and Option minus. This is what I was showing you with, if you look at my live view, and keep an eye on my exposure time, my shutter speed here. Yeah, so if you keep an eye on my shutter speed, as I hit Option minus, I'm making things darker by lowering my shutter speed. As I hit Option equal, Option plus, it's on the same key, you can see that I'm increasing my shutter speed or increasing my exposure time. So you can set that however you like, but it's nice to be able to kind of quickly bracket things because I can hit. And actually, you know what, let me change this to a smaller file size. Hopefully that'll make things go easier. But if I hit Command-K, Option minus, Command-K, minus, Command-K, you can see that I'm effectively bracketing my exposures as they come in, right? Okay. So before we go on to adjustments, let's take a minute to address questions. Okay, let's see. Okay, switching over to questions here. Let's sort by oldest. Okay. Is there a way to initiate an AFA, automated frame averaging sequence on the IQ4 from Capture One when tethered? The answer to that is no, and it is a pain in the butt. I wish they would introduce that. not just for frame averaging, but also for focus stacking or for some of the other tools that are in there. Unfortunately, there is not one, but phase one is aware that that is something that we would like at DT and a lot of our clients would like. So that's a good question. Joe, do you want to chime in on the computer stuff here for a second, just to kind of, fill things in here?
You should be all set, yeah, with the MacBook stuff. If anyone wasn't reading through chat, Capture One utilized OpenCL, which utilized your graphics processor to speed up a couple of things. Also utilize your RAM as well. So for processing your images, you get OpenCL turned on, it will utilize the GPU to help the calculation a little bit faster, and that's probably when you'll hear the fan goes on your computer. In terms of utilizing the RAMs, Capture One uses for local adjustments. When you start painting in mask, when you start doing color editor with specific color, or if you start using the local selection tools with the tonal range, all these things are calculation intensive, and that's when you'll hear your fan goes on and use different parts of the computer to kind of help with those calculations.
Thank you. There's a question about how to set the compare variant. So I guess I didn't actually talk about how to set keyboard shortcuts, which is an oversight since we're talking about keyboard shortcuts. If I hit in Capture One 20, edit, and then edit keyboard shortcuts, I can just search for the keyboard shortcut that I want. So in this case, you're asking for set compare variant. Compare. So if I just hop in here, compare, you can see that right now it is set to Shift Enter. If I want to set it to just Enter, I don't know if that's possible. Joe, do you know if it's possible to do that with just Enter? I think you might have to use Shift Enter, but there may be a way to make it.
And capture like 1, 8, 9, and 10. Took that away because people would just accidentally hit enter, set it, and didn't know how to unset it.
Yeah. Okay. So unfortunately, I don't think you can use just enter or just a modifier key, but Shift Enter or I think it was Control Enter seems to be the default in the current version of Capture One. All right. Okay, let me just tab back through these questions. We answered that one. Mark, linear scientific, we talked about that. Talked about what makes our fans go crazy. Use the return key, yep. And automated frame averaging, okay. All right, so let's move on to adjustments, okay? So adjustments are where I've used my mouse the most. And this is because I'm clicking on parts of the images. I'm using sliders to get sort of fine control. Dragging and sliding it's not as precise or quick to get to, but it is the most kind of like tactilely satisfying. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm going through all my images here and just kind of, going through like plus, minus, onto the next one, minus this, plus that. No, I do go through and I do use the sliders, right? So I'm not saying you can't use any of that. Not saying never use your mouse, but there are a few things that you can do to speed things up, all right? So if we want to do rapid adjustment of one setting, on an image-by-image basis. So let's say I've imported all of my images here, let's say, and I want to adjust the contrast, right? What I can do is I can enter that field here, and I can hit the up or down key to increase by a small amount or decrease by a small amount. If I hold Shift, I can increase by a large amount. And that holds true for pretty much every tool. right? So you can see I adjust by 1 stop versus a tenth of the stop if I don't hold shift. I can tab and shift tab to get to the next or previous field. Now the problem with this is if I'm in a text field, I can't go on to my next image just by using the left and right arrow key. However, no matter what I'm doing in any tool, if I hit Command and then the next direction, I can go to the next image and still have the ability to adjust the tool that I'm using. I don't have to leave that tool text field. So you can see that if I'm quickly going through my images here, I can do this really easily with a single setting. So if I want to make a single adjustment, I can do it very quickly to a set of images that way. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I'm going back and forth between the chat to make sure I haven't just like disconnected every now and then. So that's why I'm doing that. Rapid comparisons before and after. So this is something that it may be super obvious, but this is something that I do all the time. So I just want to touch on this a little bit. If I have a single tool and I want to reset a single field within that tool, I can take this and double click to go from whatever my current setting is back to 0, and then just Command Z and Command Shift C to undo and redo that change. Okay. So that's for a single field within a single tool. If I want to see a before and after of a tool where I've made a lot of changes, so let's say the high dynamic range tool, where I've done something wonky like that, and I want to reset it to what it was before, I can click the reset tool here and then hit Control Z, or I can hold Option, and as I click on that and then let go, you'll see that it doesn't totally reset it. It just previews it while I click and then puts it back to what it was before, like that. And then I can just hit the reset to commit to those changes. All tools. If I want to take a photo that I've just done some crazy garbage to, like this, and I want to go back to square one, Command R is the default. This is the beauty of the raw workflow. None of the changes are destructive. I can always, always, always go back to square one. Now, if I want to reset multiple tools, but not all of them at the same time, this it's not the most elegant way to do things. But I like to use clone variants as sort of save points in my workflow. So let's say that I'm adjusting my exposure, right? So I get my exposure set to where I want it. And then I want to clone a variant. And I'm going to do my shadow and highlight adjustments here. And then I'm going to do my, oops, sorry. My color balance adjustments, right? And so if I want to be able to compare the differences, before and after I did my highlights recovery, before and after I did my color balancing, a lot of times I'll use the clone variant tool for that. And so I have that hotkeyed to Command 3. You can set it to whatever you want, but that's what I've set it to because it's so easy to reach when your hands are just sort of naturally on the keyboard. The other thing to keep in mind is if you have images that have like big differences between them, and you want to flip back and forth between like 2 images to eliminate buffering time, if you clone it as a variant and wait for both of them to load, you can then switch out of the multi-view, use my hotkey for that, and then switch to there, wait for it to load, and then once it's loaded, I don't have to wait for it to buffer anymore. So I'll go to one image, and then I'll select my second image. I'll switch over to it. It'll take a second to buffer, but once it's buffered, and once this image is buffered, I can go back and forth without having to wait as long. Okay, so that's kind of how I use clone variants as save points in my workflow, and then I can always delete those or reset those later. The other cool thing about clone variants is they're saved within Eips. So a lot of times when I'm delivering a file to a client for film scanning in particular, I'll include the first variant as the negative, the next variant as the positive, and then like a final variant is like a finished version with all my edits. Okay. All right, on to the next one. Okay, super commonly repeated edits. Use presets. Two of the most common ones that I use, again, since I shoot a lot of film, is direct inversion. I gave a whole 90-minute presentation on why I don't like to use film negative. Ask me about that later if you want to hear about that. But if I want to do a direct linear inversion using levels, I can do this. Or I can go to my preset and just click invert. And if I want to make a new preset, I'll just make some changes here, click those little 3 lines and say save user preset. All right. So you'll see I have invert, and then I have another one called invert for print. The reason it's called invert for print is because I know my printer is not going to show any differences below a level of 8 and above 245, so I like to bring those in. So I know that I'm going to have detail in my shadow and highlight when I print on my personal printer. So you can have different presets for different things. The other one that I use a lot is actually in the lens tool. So if I have an image that was shot here, if I go to full corrections, I just have it set so that it turns on all my numbers here and goes to 100 on each of the sliders here. So that's a super simple one that you can use relatively often if you find yourself applying those lens corrections. All right. Another one. Don't be afraid to add multiples of the same tool to a single tab. Here you'll see I have 3 versions of the curve tool added, but I have them in different sub tabs within there, right? So one is my red, green, and my blue histogram shown at the same time. The other one that I showed earlier that I use relatively often is color balance. So I'll have one for shadow, one for midtone, and then one for highlight. Okay. And lastly, my key bindings for this. Okay, so Command-Shift-E. One of the things that I don't think I touched on here is if I select multiple files, if I apply certain settings to them, and it's not all settings that do this, but if I apply something that's like a global adjustment for like black and white, no, that's not one of them. Well, okay. One example of this is if I have, let's see, edit. If I have 4 images selected and I process them out, if I go and look at my output, and oh Lord, oh, I made 16-bit TIFFs. This is gonna, my computer's not gonna be happy. Okay, let's go to Jpeg Previews. You can see with the little, whoops. Okay, hang on, I'm just gonna wait for these TIFFs to process. Where's my process key? Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to go back here, and if I process all my images, you'll see that it's going to process all 4. If I only want to process the singular one that I have as my primary variant, I can hit Control-Shift-E, and that will only process my primary variant. And so if you're applying edits that you only want to apply to your selected variant, but you want to be able to see your other variants at the same time, that's the way to do that. Layers. Do people use layers in Capture One? You can throw this in the chat. I'm just curious. Okay, good, good. Layers are phenomenal. They're different than they are in Photoshop, but they do work really well under most circumstances now. You know, they were sort of beta-y for a while, but I think they work really well. Okay, so one of the things that I do is I have hotkeyed add a new layer to Command L, and by default, you'll see that there are a couple of options here. When I add a new layer, you can add a new empty layer or a new filled layer. Rather than choosing between the two, I just hotkeyed add an empty layer, and then I set Option I to invert the layer. So rather than having to click and add filled layer, click and add empty layer, all I need to do is hit Command L, and then if I want to fill it, I'll do that. Command L, if I want an empty layer, I'll do that. And you know, so if I have an empty layer and I want to add a gradient, I'll start that way. If I have a filled layer and I want to refine using a luma range, I'll do it that way, right? So I can do both things, either a filled layer or an empty layer with a single combination of shortcuts. So I don't have to click anywhere. And luma range is one of the things that will slow down your computer the most, because it has to dynamically calculate for every pixel. So hopefully my computer did not catch fire. Okay, there's my invert mask. M is just going to toggle your mask layer on or off. I already mentioned my clone variant, which is sort of like my mini save that I was talking about. And the last one here is the toggling single or multi-view. So if I have, let's say, 4 images selected, I want to keep those 4 images selected, but I only want to see the primary one. There's this little tool here, which is the single multi-view. And I just hotkeyed that to Shift M. So I can quickly jump back and forth there. Okay, now is another good point for questions. And then we'll go to our final part, which is output and sharing. Are there any questions from the floor? How are these layers in Capture One different from Photoshop layers? The main respect in which they're different is not so much in terms of, so there's a couple of reasons, or a couple points of variance. So one is the way that they're stored. They're not stored as like full copies of an image. They're only stored as additional adjustments within the same .cos file. So if you look at a .cos file, there can actually be multiple layer images in there, and then there's a co-layer file as well that kind of shows how they all go together. The other thing, though, and the main differentiator and the reason why I still use Photoshop for layers is Capture One is great for making adjustments, but it's not great for combining multiple images or filling content within the image from other parts of the image. So the clone stamp and the healing tool are not great, to put it generously. So that's sort of the main reason. Capture One is great at working from a single image. It's not great at filling in content for dust and spot removal or for combining multiple images. Okay. How does Capture One handle the stacking order of layers? It's top to bottom. It's pretty straightforward. You can alter the opacity of the layers. and it's all like there's no blending options like there are in Photoshop. So there's no like subtract, difference, luminosity, or any of those by default. It's just like a direct linear stack. Okay. Other questions? Okay, so we're going to move on to the last section here, and that's going to be output and share. So this was something that I struggled with for a long time, and I think it's a bug in Capture One, but when you look at your screen, and if I take an image, let's pick one like this. Reset. Okay. If I double click, it goes to 100%. But what does that mean, right, in terms of output sizes? All 100% means is that 1 pixel on my screen is equal to 1 pixel in my image, right? But if I'm printing to different sizes, it doesn't mean anything, because if I'm looking at it as, you know, let's say I want to make a quick test print of this image at like a 4:6 postcard size. If I'm editing at 100%, then I don't have any idea of like what my image size is in print. So in order to make it match the print size at 100%, there's a little trick you can do in here. So what I've done is I've created one that's called MBP 15-inch, so MacBook Pro 15-inch at 100% resolution. And if I select this, you'll see that the resolution in here is 227 pixels per inch. The reason that it's 227 pixels per inch is because that is the pixel density of the screen on my MacBook Pro. You'll see that I also have one for my AZO monitor, which is 110. Same resolution, but it's a larger dimension screen, which means that the number of pixels per inch is lower. So it's at 110. So if I go to my MacBook Pro process recipe here, and I go to recipe proofing, if I tell it that I want the short edge of my print to be 8 inches, and when I double click, it's going to go and show my image as if I expanded my image, past the borders of my screen, the short edge would only be 8 inches. If I change this to 4 inches, you'll see, recipe proofing, sorry. There we go. There we go. So you'll see now that on my screen, this is 4 inches. And so what I'm seeing, and you'll see if I double click, this is 100%, right? So even though it's super tiny, this is 100% of what my image is going to look like when I print it. And if I want to print it, I have a 17-inch printer on the long end, the roll attachment. So if I want to see my short edge at 17 inches, it's going to look like this, right, on my screen. But if I were to just reset it to whatever the default is, it's going to zoom me in all the way. And that's not really informative about what I'm going to see in print. So that's a little trick that I use. And it'll be different from monitor to monitor. You'll have to calculate your pixel per inch resolution here. But especially if you're making smaller prints with really high resolution cameras, there's no need to get lost in the details. Like if you're making a test print, just use this trick, get in there at the size that you're actually going to see, and edit that way. So if I've got like an 8x10, it's going to look like that at 100%. Okay. File routing. This is really useful if I'm doing something along the lines of, in cultural heritage, a lot of times we'll want to create what's called a DPO, or a digital preservation object. That's what the process recipe here is called. And so what that's going to be is it's going to be technically it could be an 8-bit TIFF, but it's going to be a 16-bit TIFF in this case, Adobe RGB at full resolution, and it's going to be a huge file, right? And I also want to create a reference file that's just going to be a quick JPEG preview to go along with it, so that when I deliver that to my client, they don't have to wait all day to open the file, or if it's in like WeTransfer or something, it'll preview much quicker. So what I can do is if I select multiple process recipes, under the process recipe, usually what I'll do is I will have the recipe name set in the subfolder section here, and you'll see that I have that for my JPEG preview and for my DPO. And then when I process my image, you'll see that within my output folder, it's going to say sample images, JPEG preview goes in here, my DPO will eventually go in here. There we go. And so you can see that that's the way that I can keep these separate. And if I want to just drop all my JPEG previews into an email and send them, at 121 kilobytes to the director to just get a quick look at what their selects are, I can do that. And it can be very easily organized here. The other thing that is super useful here is finding your output files. So if you're in the output menu, you'll see this little arrow here. I imagine 99% of people know this, but for the 1% that doesn't, if you click that arrow, it will just open your output folder in Finder. So it's similar to the F12 key that I have set, the show in Finder. It just opens your current output window. So no matter what you have it set to, if you need to quickly jump to there, you just hop over to this tab, and then you push that button, and it will take you out there. Okay. Key bindings here. Option X, as you saw, is going to give me my recipe proofing. Recipe proofing is interesting because what it'll do is it will give you the both in terms of color, image size, and if you're shooting JPEG artifacting, what your image is actually going to end up looking like if you have recipe proofing on. So again, I set that to option X. You can set it to whatever you want, but I like to be able to have that. And if you have like a different output color profile, like a gray, it will render that as well. So for soft proofing, that can be good as well. Command D is process selection. And now for my favorite shortcut that I use all the time when I'm processing images. Let's say I've got an image here that I'm working on. I'm really proud of it. I want to show it and text it to my mom. F, go full screen, Command Control, Shift 4 for the screenshot. Drag over, or just click the window. Or if that's the only thing open and I don't have any floating tools, just Command Control Shift 3. And then I can just post it in iMessage or in Slack or whatever and show everybody. It's the equivalent of putting it up on the refrigerator. So I do that embarrassingly often. And that's all I've got. So I want to turn it back over, and we can do questions. And hopefully this has been not too mind-numbing for everyone, and you got something out of it. Space button to move. Yep, that's right. Yes, you can do that as well. Are there any questions that I haven't gotten to yet?
Arnab, a question from Samuel. He was asking how can you use Capture One and almost like do a round trip to ARC or ACR?
Yeah. The short answer is you can't. I mean, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but any of the edits you apply to the raw file are they're proprietary to the raw processor, right? So if I apply edits in Capture One, those .cos files are not going to go along with my IIQ file when I bring it into Adobe Camera Raw. So unfortunately, and this is something that I do very often because I do use Photoshop for my spot editing and that sort of thing. So the the answer that nobody really likes to hear is that the big difference between a raw file and a 16-bit TIFF produced from that file, once you have your white balance set, once you have your sharpening and things set, once you have your mode and channels set, and once you have your color editing set, are really almost indistinguishable when it comes to the flexibility of the file. So I would highly suggest, if you're going to do that, do all of your global edits in Capture One, and then you can process it out to a TIFF. Or even more quickly, you can take your image here, right-click, edit with, Photoshop 2020, right? So it's unfortunate that there's no way to kind of do that. There is an option to output images as DNGs. That will not take into account any of the adjustments that you made. So that unfortunately does not work for that purpose either. But that is a good question. Okay. Scroll down here. Could you theoretically create presets in Capture One and duplicate the presets in ACR? Sure. Yeah. I mean, the problem is white balance is actually measured differently. If you look in Capture One, it is obnoxious. I think we didn't even discover this we didn't notice it until a while ago, but the Kelvin number actually isn't, like, it doesn't work the way that it should, because if you lower the Kelvin number, it gets bluer. And it should get more orange, right? So this doesn't actually apply. This is not actually the Kelvin of your light source, because it works in reverse. So it's totally obnoxious. That drives me crazy. But things are measured differently. So point of contrast here is not a point of contrast in Photoshop. Point of saturation here is not a point of saturation there. So you can try doing it visually, but there's no like direct take the numbers here and plug them in here that I found that works perfectly for that. But you can certainly do like general adjustments in that sense. Okay. Are there any other questions? All right. If you cannot upgrade your license, Joe, do you want to put who to contact in there? I'm just scrolling back through the things here. It looks like Joe answered most of them in the chat. So, okay. What I will do is I will send out a copy of the presentation if you guys are interested. And other than that, I think that's what we have to present today. So out of curiosity, I'm going to put people on the spot in the chat. What is, if anything, you found out today that you may not have already learned or you found interesting and that you might want to try? I'm curious to hear, if anything. Okay, custom tabs. Yep. Linear curves. Excellent. Show and find your shortcut. That's one of my favorites. Inverting film via levels. Oh boy, that's a whole can of worms. But yes, yeah, you've got that. Okay. Well then, everyone stay well and be safe. This is kind of like a condensed version and sort of a personalized version of our Capture One Masters course. There's a little bit of overlap, but if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, we have our courses as well. And we're still offering those online during this time. So it was a pleasure spending time with you all. I really hope you appreciated it, and we'll see you in future webinars.